Hello, I'm Brandon Olson, and the working title for my pitch is Transmutation. Transmutation is themed on witches using transmutation magic to overcome their various problems. The hook of transmutation is that the player can not only just alter the size of their character, but specific pieces of their environment as well. Transmutation is a top-down 3D game in a similar vein as Bastion. The player must overcome progressively difficult puzzles through the use of magic that will alter the size of specific pieces of their environment as well as themselves. The first mechanic in transmutation we'll touch on is growing. Growing will allow the player to increase their size as well as the size of specific environmental pieces. This increase in size for the player will allow them to interact with specific environmental pieces they could not before, such as ledges they can now climb upon. Additionally, when the player increases the size of specific environmental pieces, they can now allow the player to get to higher vantage points. For example, they can now create lifts thanks to this. Additionally, the growth ability increases the player's strength. This allows them to lift heavy objects that they could not previously and move them to separate locations. For instance, they can now lift a heavy boulder and put on a pressure plate to unlock a door. The second mechanic we'll touch upon in transmutation is shrinking. Shrinking works in a very similar way to the growing ability, except in reverse. The reason a player would use this ability is to allow them to fit in tight corridors or to lower the height of an obstacle. Additionally, they can shrink the size of an object they need to lift that is still much too large for the growth ability. This will allow the growth ability to let them pick it up. Transmutation will feature several obstacles the player will have to overcome during the playtime, the main being the puzzles that the player has to solve. In addition to the puzzles, the game will feature special barriers that will avert all of the changes the player has done. They will act similar to the portal barriers that reverted all of the portals. For instance, if a player goes through it and they are in their growth state, they will revert to their base state. As you can see here, this is an example of a puzzle much later into transmutation. The player's goal is to take the large stone and place it into the red circle. The stone is placed too high for the player initially, so they must reduce the size of the barrier and increase their size so they can pick up the stone. But they also must reduce the stone as it is slightly too big. After taking down the stone, they must shrink themselves and roll it under to get it past the barriers. After the player has successfully rolled the stone under the pedestals, they must place it onto another pedestal as well as themselves and increase the pedestal size. This will allow them to get to a higher point. At this point, they must roll the stone across and eventually through one of the barriers. Once the player goes through this barrier, it will revert its size as well as the players, and they must increase their size to keep it from rolling downhill and successfully roll it over the edge and into the goal. Initially, Transmutation aims to have around 20 levels. This, of course, can be reduced to take into account time constraints. Additionally, 3 separate models will have to be made for the player as well as all the interactable objects for all of their size variations. This way, all of the meshes look cohesive to their correct size. Of course, transmutation comes with risks just like any other game, the most obvious of which is that we're all relatively new to game design. But additional risks include the fact that it is a puzzle game, which takes longer to playtest and make sure the puzzles are fun and not overtly obvious. Additional risks include the fact that 3 separate models will have to be made, which may take time away from anything else. I'm Brandon Olson, and this was Transmutation, and thank you for watching.